In the marshlands of 1880s Kentucky, Hollow Creek Jail crouched low in the mud, stone sunk to its knees, iron sweating under fog that tasted like old pennies. From the road it seemed small. Inside it felt endless, corridors that leaned downward even when a man climbed. The creek behind the yard ran brown and slow, leaving a ring on the rear wall like a bruise that never faded. People said the marsh stopped escaping, but it did more. It ate prints, swallowed noise, and pushed a heavy breath into the lungs until a man felt half buried while still standing. Cells faced each other along a narrowing hall so that the far end looked like a pinhole, and hope shrank as you walked. The locks were older than the men who turned them, and every click sounded final. A ledger table stood under green glass that washed every page sickly. At dusk, the keeper lit a candle in a dish of salt and wrote the names of the living, then drew a dash for the unaccounted. The town believed those words because they trusted the man who wrote them. Elias Grieves came to church with clean cuffs and a gentle smile, paid for school slates when coal ran thin and sent baskets to the widow. When he walked the tier, he folded his hands behind his back like a teacher, and if he bent to speak, guards saw the prisoner nod as if receiving quiet help. Yet the air around him held a hush, like a room just after prayer when no one knows whether to sit or stand. Grieves liked order. He watched how men answered touch, light, and sound. He had the walls scraped smooth at hand height so there was nothing to grip when panic rose, and he had the floors sloped so a drop of water placed at one end would be under a cot by night. Meals were salted until tongues stayed raw. Water rations came by bell, and the bell was sometimes late. In summer, the cells grew still and hot. In winter, the creek climbed the stones and sat in the bones like a second skeleton. The jail did not kill fast, it thinned. Overcrowding did the rest. 8 men to a pen meant no one could lie full length or own a thought unshared. A cough at night became a rhythm that took over the mind. Some prayed, some pressed their eyes to the bars, some counted pipe ticks. They said the worst was not the smell, but the silence that followed a cry, when the hall seemed to lean inward and listen. Escape stories began as jokes and grew into habit. On fog nights, the town heard 2 men had slipped a lock or dug through plaster. By morning, there were no prints past the yard and no cut fences. People said the marsh kept its own, yet widows swore they saw a jacket sleeve or hat brim float up and then sink as if tugged from below. Records called these events escapes, always that word, never missing. The dashes in the ledger lined up neatly as fence posts, and no one asked why an escape always came on a night when the jail bell rang out of order. No one asked why the locks showed no scratches or why a guard who filed a report would take a sudden week of leave. On the yard, flagstones' faint arcs of chalk were rubbed thin by boots, and there was a drain that went nowhere yet stayed warm to the touch. Men inside learned to track time by signs that were not clocks. Mold spreading from a window frame and shrinking when sun found the glass. Creek smell turning sweet before a storm. Grieves pausing at cell 4 each evening as if greeted by someone unseen. Old stories lingered. A boy jailed for a stolen horse left a note that ended mid-word. A drifter carved little rivers and was not there to finish the last branch. But the marsh did not ring bells late, did not erase ledger names, did not make a man leave church with a smile that lingered. Hollow Creek kept a simple face for the world: stone, iron, law. Beneath it ran a second face, patient and exact, that measured men grain by grain until even their shadows thinned. He alone seemed calm when storms rose, moving like a clock across the tiers at the same steps nightly. The camera of memory moves now through the corridor, past the candle and the green glass, to the soft footfall of the man the town trusted most. Because the story of this place is not only about walls, it is about the hand that knew how to use them. Elias Grieves stood in the center of Hollow Creek like a monument carved from kindness, a man who never raised his voice and never broke his smile. He was the sort who bowed his head at supper, the sort who slipped coins into the palms of widows outside church, the sort who children ran toward in the market. To the townspeople he was proof that goodness could hold power, that faith could govern without cruelty. Yet the prisoners who stared through the bars at that same gentle face saw something different. They saw a man whose prayers were not meant for God but for control, whose soft words carried the weight of invisible chains. When he opened his Bible at night rounds, he did not read for comfort but for command, shaping verses into punishments that blurred the line between scripture and sentence. In his office hung no whips, no clubs, no ropes. He had no need for tools that left obvious scars. Instead, his cruelty grew from stillness, from patience, from an ability to make men surrender without raising a hand. He understood that true pain was not the lash, but the slow unraveling of a man's self. A thief might resist the chain, but he could not resist the silence that followed the warden's visits. Silence so heavy it left him doubting whether his thoughts belonged to him at all. Grieves believed punishment should not end at the body. It should seep into the marrow, reshape the mind, and leave behind only obedience. His rituals were hidden in plain sight. When a prisoner fell ill, he would kneel at the cot and pray in tones so calm it was impossible to know whether he begged for healing or decay. When a man died, Grieves would insist on closing the eyes himself, whispering a verse while his hand lingered too long over the mouth as though feeling the last trace of breath. At the gallows he kept his gaze fixed not on the rope but on the condemned's eyes, drinking in the final collapse of resistance. He did not hunger for death itself, but for that moment when a man's will bent, when fear erased all thought of self and what remained was an empty vessel ready to be filled with silence. The guards noticed, though none dared speak. They saw how he measured punishments in precise increments, denying sleep in cycles of 3 days, rationing water in patterns that matched psalm counts, instructing men to kneel in circles drawn in chalk as if part of some sermon the outside world would never hear. Each detail was wrapped in the language of discipline, yet the structure felt rehearsed, too exact, too much like ritual. The prisoners felt it most. They whispered of nights when Grieves walked the tiers with a candle held low, letting wax drip in careful lines across the stones as though marking invisible boundaries. Those who crossed them by mistake woke to find their beds soaked in brine, their skin raw from salt that no guard admitted placing there. What unsettled men most was not pain, but Grieves' affection. He addressed each inmate by name, even those he had seen only once. He recalled their crimes in detail, speaking of them not as acts but as flaws of spirit, as if he knew them before they entered his walls. To some he offered hymns, to others silence but never choice. The more he smiled, the less they felt themselves. Men spoke of strange dreams, of voices in their ears that repeated the warden's prayers long after he left the hall. One swore he could not remember the face of his own mother, only the calm features of Elias Grieves, as if the jailer's gaze had scraped clean his memory and filled it with the image of obedience. The town could not see this. They saw only the man who carried a worn Bible under his arm, who shook hands after Sunday service and asked after children's lessons. Mothers said they felt safe knowing their sons, if ever jailed, would be under the care of such a godly man. Yet inside the jail, safety meant nothing. Men learned that the warden's touch could soothe or burn, that his prayers could lift or crush, and that his presence itself was the punishment. They began to dread the sound of his footsteps more than the rattle of keys, for keys only open doors. But the warden's steps opened the soul to violation no one could name. The truth of Elias Grieves was not that he was cruel, but that his cruelty was hidden behind gentleness. It was the kind of evil that did not scream or strike, but whispered and waited. He needed no dungeon darker than the mind, no torture sharper than silence. And as he moved through the tears with his measured smile and his soft words, every prisoner knew the same truth. Hollow Creek did not need chains when it had Elias Grieves. What escaped his lips as prayer entered men's bones as command, and what looked like faith was only the slow erasure of all that made them human. And so the jail stood quiet, the warden's smile lingering like a saint's blessing in town and like a curse carved into flesh within, the line between the two never seen but always felt. They were 19 in number, drawn from different counties, different sins, and different hungers, yet bound together by the stone ribs of Hollow Creek. To the records they were case files, dashes on a ledger, men to be watched until their sentences wore them thin. But to Elias Grieves they were something more. Not prisoners, not souls to be saved, but pieces to be ordered and consumed in a design only he understood. He never said so aloud, never marked them in any visible way. Yet the guards noticed how he paused longer at certain cells, how his gaze drifted as though counting a pattern invisible to all but him. The 19 men felt it most. The sense of being measured not for what they had done, but for what was still to be taken from them. The first was Samuel Brandt, a farmhand caught stealing from his master's stores. A boy of only 19, his crime was hunger. Yet his eyes were restless, and he scratched marks into the wood of his cot as though keeping time against something pressing close. He was followed by David Mallory, who had beaten a man dead in a tavern brawl and never stopped laughing afterward. Mallory's laughter grew thin inside Hollow Creek, replaced by whispers no one else could hear. Then came Silas Crow, who lured travelers into gullies with false lanterns, leaving their bodies for wolves. He watched the warden with sharp, curious eyes, as though recognizing a predator greater than himself. Among them sat Henry Lowe, a preacher accused of begging widows for coins while calling it charity. His voice carried hymns even in the dark, but his knees trembled when Grieves stood near, as though he knew his counterfeit faith had been unmasked. Charles Red Harlan had burned a barn with a family inside, yet in jail he wept at night like a child, whispering to shadows that seemed to answer him. James Cray was older, a forger who passed false notes across the state line. He smiled at guards with confidence, yet after weeks in Hollow Creek his signature hand shook too much to hold a spoon. The younger ones carried their own burdens. Thomas Greeley, barely 16, had stabbed his stepfather in defense of his mother, yet the court called it murder. He entered with wide eyes and left notes beneath his pillow as if writing to someone who would never answer. Edward Pike, a pickpocket, held more scars on his wrists from his own teeth than from shackles, gnawing at himself when silence grew too long. Andrew Stark, a gambler with debts carved into his bones, begged every night for the chance to shuffle cards. But Greaves never allowed it, watching instead as Stark's hands twitched until they curled into claws. There were darker figures still. Elias Boone strangled animals before he strangled a woman. Benjamin Carr slit throats in alleyways for pocket change. Rufus Doyle beat his children near death and swore it was discipline. Each man carried not just guilt, but a shadow that thickened in the halls until their very names seemed soaked with malice. Yet the jail's cruelty did not distinguish between the petty and the monstrous. To Elias Grieves, all 19 were threads in one cloth, woven together not by their crimes but by their placement in his unseen ritual. Some men sensed this and grew quiet as if preparing themselves for an ending they could not name. Others resisted, shouting against the walls until their voices broke. The strongest were the first to bend. The murderer Mallory ceased laughing altogether, his mouth twisting as though frozen in the echo of a joke unfinished. The preacher Henry fell silent in prayer, as if words had been taken from him. Even Silas Crow, the lantern man, stopped meeting eyes, bowing his head when the warden passed, like a predator turned hound. The townspeople knew only the list of names, 19 criminals sent to Hollow Creek for keeping. They did not know the feeling inside those cells, the sense that each man was being stripped of his self piece by piece, until nothing remained but the husk of a body waiting for a command. The prisoners themselves felt the bond of their number, though they never spoke it aloud. They began to sense a rhythm in the warden's visits, a pattern in the way punishments fell. One would be denied food when another was given double, one kept awake when another was forced to dream. They were balanced, weighed like scales, 19 not as men but as parts of an equation moving toward some terrible sum. Their crimes had brought them here, but their curses held them. Each carried more than the weight of their past. Samuel Brandt's hunger returned in dreams that gnawed at him from within. Thomas Greeley's knife seemed to glint in the corner of his vision, waiting for his hand though it was gone. Andrew Stark shuffled invisible cards at night, his fingers bleeding from friction against air. Hollow Creek did not free them from their sins, it magnified them until they filled the narrow cells like smoke, and through that smoke moved Elias Grieves, smiling gently, offering prayers, turning their flaws into instruments for his design. The 19 men did not know yet what was coming. They could not see the chamber below, or the chalk circles, or the slow arrangement of their fates. But they felt it in the marrow of their bones, in the way the air seemed to thicken each time Grieves passed. They were no longer individuals with sentences to serve. They were offerings chosen not for justice but for erasure. And as their stories tangled together, they became less like prisoners and more like a choir of doomed voices, their number held constant, their humanity already fading, their end already written in the silence of Hollow Creek. The punishments of Hollow Creek bore little resemblance to anything found in ordinary prisons, For Elias Grieves did not believe in the visible scars of whips or chains. He wanted suffering that went deeper, punishments that rewrote the self from the inside out. In his mind, pain was not an end, but a tool, a process to strip away the layers of defiance until only silence remained. To the guards, he spoke of discipline, of moral correction, but in practice his methods resembled experiments, each carefully measured and repeated with the patience of a man recording results. The prisoners called them rituals, though no one dared use the word aloud. They felt more like ceremonies than punishments, each one precise, exact, and built to destroy the mind before the body. One of his favored practices took place in the echo chambers, narrow stone vaults built beneath the old foundation where voices multiplied until they seemed to come from every direction. Prisoners were led inside blindfolded and forced to kneel on the floor, their hands bound behind them. The chamber was sealed, and then the silence was broken by the sound of their own cries reflected back 100-fold. A single gasp turned into a roar, every word magnified until it was unbearable. Men screamed to empty the pressure, but the more they screamed, the louder it became, bouncing back at them like 1,000 invisible mouths. Some tried to remain quiet, but the smallest groan was enough to shatter their nerves. Hours inside left them unable to distinguish between their own voice and something else shrieking alongside it. By the time the door opened, most stumbled out with swollen throats and broken minds, unable to speak without trembling. The punishment did not leave marks on their bodies, but it hollowed them out, erasing their ability to trust the sound of their own voice. Another method was colder, more deliberate, carried out in the cisterns beneath the marsh. These pits were filled with water drawn from the creek, chilled until the surface filmed over with ice. Prisoners were forced inside naked, their feet chained so they could not climb out. Torches were set around the rim, their flames casting cruel light on men shivering in the black water. The ritual was always the same. Grieves would lower a wooden cross or a book of scripture to the prisoner's level and order him to chant verses. At first the words came strong, desperate, rising from clenched teeth. But as the water pulled heat from their bodies, the chanting weakened, their voices cracking and breaking until the last fragments were no longer words but raw sobs pulled through torn lungs. Some fainted and had to be dragged out, their skin blue and blistered from cold. Others tried to hold silence, but Grieves did not permit it. Guards jabbed them with poles until they chanted again, forcing their voices through the icy pain. The aim was not death, at least not directly. It was submission, breaking their will until prayer no longer carried meaning, only reflex until faith itself was frozen and shattered inside them. But Grieves was never satisfied with mere endurance. He crafted punishments that targeted the senses, dismantling the way men perceived reality. In one cell, he placed prisoners in total darkness, feeding them only at random hours until their bodies no longer knew day from night. In another, he had them kneel over sharp grains of dried maize spread across stone, the kernels piercing skin until blood mixed with husks. Each man was made to stay until his knees swelled and split, and when they could not kneel any longer, they were lashed back into place with strips of cloth, the softness mocking the brutality. He called it penance, but it was more than that. It was designed. He believed suffering should not just punish but reprogram, until the body no longer resisted because it did not know how. What haunted the men most was the silence after. Each punishment ended not with release, but with stillness, the kind that made the air itself feel heavy. Grieves never shouted, never struck them himself. He watched, hands folded, lips moving as though in prayer, eyes calm as the punishments unraveled the men before him. He recorded their responses with a mind that seemed closer to a physician than a jailer. Yet his goal was not healing. It was a transformation. He was turning men into shadows of themselves, stripping away thought, memory, identity, until only the outline of a human remained. Even the guards grew uneasy. They had served under wardens who used chains, whips, starvation, yet this was different. They noticed how the men returned to their cells quieter than before, as though some essential part of them had been taken. They noticed how certain prisoners stared too long at nothing, lips moving soundlessly, repeating chants that no longer made sense. And they noticed how the number 19 was always preserved, no matter what sickness or injury took hold. Those who seemed close to death were pulled back with sudden rations of food or warmth, kept alive until their suffering was complete. Grieves allowed no accidents, no losses. Each man had his place in a pattern only he could see, and he would not allow the design to break. The cruelty of Hollow Creek was not chaos. It was careful, measured, repeated like a litany. The prisoners came to dread not only the punishments themselves, but the order behind them. They began to feel less like men and more like specimens arranged for some unseen altar. The jail's walls absorbed their cries, the marsh its silence, but Elias Grieves absorbed their humanity piece by piece, until nothing remained but fragments. And though the town saw a pious man who bowed in church and spoke softly of duty, within Hollow Creek the 19 knew the truth. Their suffering was not a byproduct of punishment. It was the purpose. And the purpose was not justice, but silence. The night of the disappearance carried a weight unlike any other. August of 1887 had been heavy with storms, the air swollen with heat that would not break. But on that particular night the world turned quiet, as if the marsh itself were holding its breath. Fog rose from Hollow Creek in thick ropes, swallowing the road, the fields, even the stars. To those who lived nearby it was a silence both unnatural and sharp, as though something behind the mist waited to be revealed. In the records of the jail, the ledger showed a single line of ink, written with the steady hand of Elias Grieves. Escape, 19 men. Yet no guard who worked that shift spoke the truth with confidence, and none who repeated the tale seemed certain whether they were describing an escape at all. According to official statements, the prisoners worked together, crafting lockpicks from scraps of metal smuggled from the kitchen, digging a narrow tunnel beneath the wall with spoons and fragments of bone. It was written as a feat of cunning, a testament to the will of desperate men. But no tunnel was ever found, and the locks on the cells showed no damage. The walls, slick with moss and water, had no gaps. And beyond the yard, no footprints marked the marsh soil. The fog was thick, but not thick enough to erase 19 sets of tracks. Hunters searched the woods, dogs sniffed the creek, and yet not one trail could be followed past the edge of the jail. It was as though the marsh had consumed them the moment they stepped outside, leaving behind only silence. Whispers soon replaced facts. Neighbors living near the jail claimed to have seen the glow of torches moving in the yard, not scattered in confusion but in lines, deliberate and symmetrical, as though tracing a pattern no one could understand. Some swore they heard chanting carried faintly through the fog, not the cries of prisoners fleeing, but a rhythm, deep and steady, repeated as if rehearsed. One man who lingered too close to the walls insisted the voices were not those of the prisoners at all, but of the guards, their words broken by the distance yet arranged with a cadence that unsettled him. And over all of it, rising from the heart of the jail, came screams, sharp at first and then suddenly cut short, swallowing mid-breath as if the air itself had smothered them. The next morning, when the fog cleared, the jail stood as though nothing had happened. 19 beds lay empty, but the cells were locked. The bars were unbroken, the windows sealed. It looked less like an escape and more like a vanishing. Guards avoided each other's eyes, refusing to speak of the night. One swore he had fallen asleep despite his terror and woke to silence, the cells already empty. Another claimed to have been sent from his post by Grieves himself, ordered to fetch scripture from the chapel only to return and find the men gone. None of their stories aligned, yet all ended with the same hollow phrase. They escaped. But questions pressed in from outside. How could 19 men vanish without sound, without trace, without resistance? Families demanded answers, clutching at the hope that their sons and brothers had truly broken free. Yet no sightings were reported in the weeks that followed. No bodies washed up in the marsh. No rumors of fugitives across county lines. The marsh remained still, the jail locked, and the ledger marked only by Grieves' calm hand. It was a story too neat, too polished, the kind designed to erase rather than explain. Behind closed doors, the whispers spread darker still. Some said the 19 had not escaped, but had been taken beneath, into chambers the public never saw. Others claimed Grieves had orchestrated the entire night, staging the appearance of an escape to mask a ritual that required silence, fog, and fire. Witnesses clung to their visions of torchlight moving in circles, of chanting that grew louder just before the screams stopped. The thought grew that perhaps the prisoners were not meant to flee but to be consumed, not lost to freedom but given over to something deeper, something Grieves served in secret. And yet the town did not protest. They had always trusted the warden and had always believed his smile. When he spoke of tragedy, of criminals too cunning to be held, they nodded and turned away. No one asked why no bodies were found, why no dogs caught a scent, why no footprints led beyond the walls. They accepted the ledger line as truth because it was easier to believe in escape than to admit to erasure. The official record closed with neat handwriting, while the truth rotted beneath it unseen. But the men who had been there, the guards who carried the memory of torchlight and chanting, did not sleep soundly again. Some left their posts and never returned, vanishing into the marsh as if trying to escape the memory itself. Others drowned their silence in drink, muttering in half-formed words about a night when the jail seemed less like a prison and more like a church to something unspeakable. And through it all, Elias Grieves remained calm, his Bible under his arm, his voice soft in prayer, his smile unbroken, the only man who seemed untouched by the disappearance. He never called it a tragedy, never called it a mystery. He spoke of it only as escape, a single word that kept the town quiet and the truth buried in the marsh fog. 19 men were gone, yet no evidence marked their path. They did not reach the woods, did not cross the creek, did not leave even the imprint of a footstep. They had been present one moment and erased the next, their cries replaced by silence, and in that silence the legend of Hollow Creek deepened, for those who listened closely knew the difference between an escape and a sacrifice. Beneath Hollow Creek, below the stone foundation and deeper still into the damp earth, there was a chamber that never appeared on maps or plans. The stairs that led to it were hidden under a trap door disguised as flooring in the warden's quarters, narrow steps cut into the mud, packed and hardened over years of use. Few had ever descended them besides Elias Grieves, and those who did never returned. The air grew thicker the lower one went, not with the scent of mold or water, but with something heavier, metallic, almost like blood baked into soil. At the bottom lay a vault built with intention, its walls reinforced with brick darkened by smoke and its ceiling low enough that a man felt pressed down before he even reached the instruments waiting within. This was not a cell. It was not a room for punishment. It was a theater of erasure. The 19 were brought here not as prisoners seeking freedom, but as offerings carried into the core of the warden's design. Grieves did not march them in as a group. They were taken in pairs, sometimes alone, bound and blindfolded so that when the cloth was removed, their first sight was always the instruments, structures of wood, iron, and mirror, crafted less like tools and more like altars. Each device had a purpose. Each was a ritual in itself. The chamber was not a place to kill swiftly, but to rewrite what it meant for a man to die. The first prisoner was led to the mirrored coffin, a tall iron frame lined with polished glass, each panel angled to capture the body in countless reflections. Forced upright, his arms were pinned at his sides, and as the door clanged shut, he was left alone with nothing but his own multiplied face staring back at him. At first he shouted, demanded release, and pounded until his fists split. But the mirrors gave no reply except the endless echo of his desperation. With each passing hour, he saw less of himself as a man and more as distortion, eyes swelling, jaw twitching, breath fogging his own reflection until it looked like another creature trapped with him. By the time his screams fell into whispers, his mind was already broken, drowned not in darkness but in the unbearable weight of seeing himself dissolve. Another was strapped to a bench carved with shallow grooves, his body bared as heated iron letters were pressed into his flesh. Grieves read scripture as he worked, each verse matching the shape of the brand, each word burned until skin bubbled and blackened, curling into parchment. To the warden it was an inscription, a writing of holy word upon the sinful body. A ritual meant to replace flesh with text, to make a man into a page that could be read until it crumbled. When the prisoner fainted, water was thrown to rouse him, not to save him, but to prolong his role until the scripture was complete. He did not die quickly. He burned piece by piece, his body becoming less a person than a vessel-turned artifact, offered to a god of silence only the warden served. Others were given deaths just as exact. One was bound to a chair fixed beneath a funnel, his mouth forced open while salt water poured drop by drop until his tongue swelled and his throat tore. Another was suspended over a pit of sharpened reeds, lowered inch by inch, until his body weight drove the barbs through his skin. Some were forced to kneel for hours inside chalk circles drawn by Grieves himself. their limbs bound until blood flow stopped and gangrene crept while the warden stood in prayer. Each method was deliberate, chosen not for cruelty alone but for meaning, a symbolic exchange where suffering itself was the language. Grieves did not kill with rage nor with haste. He moved calmly between each man, his lips whispering verses, his hands steady. To him, these were not executions but ceremonies, offerings to a darkness he believed demanded obedience. He saw the 19 not as men but as materials, their screams as hymns, their bodies as scripture. Where others would see torture, he saw completion, a ritual of silence carved into flesh and bone. And when each voice finally stopped, when each body slumped into stillness, Grieves did not rejoice. He simply recorded the moment in his ledger, noting time, method, and silence achieved as though documenting nothing more than routine duty. When the chamber emptied, 19 men had been erased, not by escape but by ritual. Their remains were hidden in the marsh, their names struck from records, their identities absorbed into the void that Grieves worshipped. Above ground, the jail remained quiet, torches snuffed, cells locked as if nothing had happened. But beneath, the chamber still pulsed with the memory of screams cut short, of prayers twisted into instruments, of a ritual that had reached its perfect sum. And Elias Grieves' gentle smile unbroken climbed the stairs to resume his place as warden, saint to the town, executioner to the silence below. After the 19 were gone, Hollow Creek did not mourn and it did not confess. The jail moved forward as though the men had simply walked into the fog and vanished. On paper, that was exactly what had happened. The ledgers were neat, rewritten in the careful hand of Elias Grieves, the old entries blotted out with ink or scraped clean until no mark of their names remained. To the state, they became a single line of explanation: escape, location unknown. The 19 ceased to exist as individuals, reduced to nothing more than an absence. But beneath the ink and beneath the silence, something festered. The truth was too large to erase, yet too dangerous to speak. Families came first, mothers clutching worn photographs, wives begging for details, children waiting in the yard for fathers who would never return. They crowded the iron gates, shouting for answers, asking when the search parties would begin. They were met not with anger, not even with pity, but with a practiced calm. The guards repeated what they had been told. The men escaped. The marsh swallowed their trail. Nothing more could be done. Questions about tracks, about tunnels, about how 19 could vanish without a single witness outside the walls were met with the same answer spoken in the same tone. They escaped. It was not explanation. It was erasure, repeated until it replaced truth in the minds of those who wanted to believe. And yet some did not believe it. They pressed harder, demanding to see the books, demanding to know how the cells were opened, how the guards failed to act. For those families, the visits became shorter, the doors closed quicker, the answers colder. Soon they stopped coming at all. Inside the office of Elias Grieves, the ledger stood as the only official record. Where names had once been written in black ink, now there were dashes, empty lines marking absence without identity. He alone controlled the pen, and he wrote with the patience of a man chiseling stone. The guards watched him at his desk, dipping the nib carefully, striking through a name as though striking through a life. He did not flinch, did not hesitate. It was done with the precision of ritual, the erasure as important to him as the punishments had been. If the suffering below had been the ceremony, then the rewriting above was the seal, the completion of the act. Some guards could not bear it. They spoke in whispers after shift, voices shaking, insisting that what they had witnessed could not be explained by tunnels or picks. They described torchlight moving in lines, chanting that came not from prisoners but from their own fellow men, the sudden silence when the screams stopped all at once. They swore the disappearance was not escape, but something darker, something orchestrated, and yet those who spoke too openly found themselves removed. One guard was said to have resigned and moved west, but no one saw him leave. Another was found drowned in the marsh, his face pressed into the mud as though held there by unseen hands. Each disappearance carried its own excuse, but soon the rest understood. Silence was safer than truth. They stopped asking, stopped whispering, stopped looking. Hollow Creek devoured not only prisoners but witnesses. Still fragments of truth slipped out, smuggled like contraband. Letters written in secret by prisoners before the 19 vanished began to surface among families. Some were scraps torn from ledgers, others scrawled on bits of cloth or thin slivers of wood. They spoke of punishments too strange to believe, of chambers where echoes drove men mad, of nights spent submerged in freezing water until voices cracked from forced prayer. They wrote of the warden's candlelit visits, the lines of salt across floors, the way he watched them as though waiting for something other than repentance. Most who read these letters dismiss them as exaggeration born of misery, but others clutched them as proof that Hollow Creek was not a jail at all but a place of ritual cruelty, a place where justice was never the purpose. Along the marsh, graves began to appear. Not marked with names, not even with crosses, only patches of disturbed soil where weeds grew differently, where the ground sagged as though hiding weight. Children found bones washed up after storms, fragments too small to trace but too human to mistake. Dogs returned from the edge of the water carrying skulls with teeth still intact. Each time Grieves explained the remains as belonging to vagrants, to drifters lost in the marsh. Each time the town accepted his answer. They trusted the man who smiled kindly, who donated to the church, who bowed his head at every meal. They trusted him even as the soil gave up pieces of the truth. But trust did not stop the rot. Hollow Creek's silence spread like damp in the walls, creeping into the town itself. People spoke less freely, looking over their shoulders before whispering rumors. Some refused to walk near the jail at night, claiming they heard faint chanting beneath the fog, voices repeating patterns that made no sense but carried weight all the same. The legend of the 19 grew in shadows, unspoken yet present in every glance at the marsh. Families moved away. The blacksmith shut his shop without a word. The town's church, once filled with hymns, grew thin in its attendance, as though the faithful sensed their prayers had no place in a land where silence had become the only God. Elias Grieves continued his routine unchanged. He walked to church each Sunday, Bible in hand. He tended the garden behind his quarters, his smile calm as ever. He nodded to widows in town and pressed coins into small hands. To anyone who asked, the escape of the 19 was a closed matter, tragic but simple. They were gone. That was all. But beneath the quiet gestures, beneath the gentle smile, lay the truth no one dared name. The 19 had not escaped at all. They had been taken, erased not only from the jail, but from memory, sacrificed in body and in record, their absence sealed in ink and silence. The chamber below had swallowed them, the marsh had hidden them, and the warden had erased them. And though the jail stood silent, the weight of what had been done lingered, pressing against the walls, pressing into the hearts of those who still lived nearby. The truth of Hollow Creek was buried, yet its shadow had already spread too far to be contained. By the dawn of a new century, Hollow Creek Jail was no longer a place of order, but a husk, its walls sagging into the marsh as though the earth itself was trying to swallow it whole. The state had stopped sending prisoners years earlier, claiming the building was unsafe, yet the true danger was not rot or damp, but memory. The townspeople kept their distance, crossing the road on the far side whenever possible. They said the jail breathed, even on still days when no wind touched the trees, its broken windows inhaling fog and exhaling whispers. The air around the ruins carried a chill that clung to the skin, a cold born not of season but of presence, the kind that reminded anyone nearby that silence had weight. In 1902, the official word was final. Hollow Creek was condemned, unfit for holding even the lowest of men. Papers spoke of poor foundations, of marshland erosion, of walls sinking under their own age. But what no record explained was why no demolition crew ever touched it. Contractors sent to tear down the stones refused to work after setting foot inside. Men who entered with hammers returned pale and trembling, saying the floors shifted under them, that the walls seemed to breathe with a pulse not their own. Some swore they heard counting, 19 voices in unison rising from the darkness below the floors, stopping only when the last number was reached before beginning again. When asked what they were counting, no one could say, only that the sound burrowed into the bones like a rhythm impossible to forget. Storms did their part in reclaiming what men would not. Rain fell heavy through broken roof beams, seeping into the stone until moss grew thick across the cells. The marsh advanced, vines curling through windows, mud pressing upward through cracks in the floor as though the earth itself was trying to choke off the space. Yet even as nature moved to erase it, the jail resisted, clinging to form long after it should have fallen. Locals passing by at night saw lanterns flicker in the yard, though no one lived there. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to go near the place, tails tucked, teeth bared, growling at shadows that stretched across the marsh when no sun or moon could cast them. And those who wandered too close alone often reported a feeling of being watched, not by one set of eyes, but by many 19 pairs hidden in the black. Stories spread of men who entered as skeptics, daring each other for coin, only to leave with streaks of white hair or voices that cracked in mid-sentence. One young man was found at dawn sitting against the gate, his mind broken, muttering the same words again and again. He smiled. He never explained who, but the townspeople needed no name. They knew whose smile lingered even after the walls had crumbled. Elias Grieves had long since died in his bed, his body discovered with lips curved gently as if he had passed in peace. Yet the jail seemed to keep breathing for him, carrying forward his ritual even when his hand no longer turned the key. The state's silence only deepened suspicion. Inspectors visited once, took notes, and left without comment. Their report never reached the public, their findings sealed. Rumors grew that the men who entered heard the same counting, that they too felt the ground shift as though something beneath stirred with every step. The order came swiftly after. Hollow Creek would not be demolished but left to collapse on its own. No crew would be ordered, no stone removed, as if to disturb it was to invite something worse. The jail was left standing like a wound never stitched, bleeding into the marsh in silence. By autumn of that year, a storm pushed through and the roof finally caved, pulling walls down with it in a slow groan that rolled across the valley. The collapse made no thunder, no great explosion of sound, only a sigh as though the building had been waiting for permission to die. When the dust cleared, what remained was ruin. Half-submerged walls, broken iron bars twisted upward like ribs, and a yard sunk into the earth where the soil turned blacker than the marsh itself. People expected relief, yet unease only deepened. Those who approached swore they still heard whispers rising from the rubble, whispers that did not scatter with the collapse but grew clearer. 19 voices speaking numbers in endless repetition, pausing only to begin again. The legend of Hollow Creek did not die with the stones. It grew stronger, fed by silence and absence. Families of the 19 had no graves to visit, no remains to bury, only the swamp where the jail had stood, and so they told their children never to step near, never to linger in the fog. The marsh became a boundary line, a place avoided not by law but by fear. Travelers who asked about the ruins were told only that the jail fell long ago, but the eyes of the townspeople always shifted when they spoke, as though even mentioning its name could stir something from below. By the time Hollow Creek was fully consumed by mud and vine, its story had already become untouchable. Official records listed 19 men as escaped, lost to history. Yet the whispers of the town told another truth. They said the jail had never released them at all. It had taken them, held them, and buried them in silence. And though the walls collapsed and the stones sank into the earth, the weight of what happened there never lifted. It lingered in fog, in marsh water, in the hush of windless nights when silence seemed to breathe, carrying the memory of 19 voices that would never be free. Decades passed and Hollow Creek sank deeper into the marsh until little remained but fragments of stone half buried in mud and memory. Yet the story of the 19 did not vanish with the ruin. It surfaced in fragments, in whispers, in documents sealed for years and later unsealed when those who had signed them were long dead. Hidden in archives were letters once smuggled by guards, reports marked confidential, notes scrawled in margins of ledgers that survived the fire and damp. They spoke of disappearances, of men unaccounted for, of a warden whose methods never matched the law he swore to uphold. These records did not name Hollow Creek in public hearings, but behind closed doors and quiet committees they shaped change. Prison codes were altered, oversight boards created, new restrictions placed on solitary confinement and punishment. The reforms were explained as progress, as humanity finding its way, but those who read the buried files knew the truth. They were built on the silence of Hollow Creek. The state never admitted to erasure. It never confessed to the 19, never acknowledged the chambers below or the rituals whispered by frightened guards. Instead, it offered a gesture so small it seemed an insult. In a courthouse corridor, tucked between portraits of judges and plaques of donors, a plain bronze plate was installed. It bore no names, no dates, only 4 words. To those erased. Passers-by seldom noticed it, yet those who did felt its weight. It was not mourning. It was not justice. It was a quiet admission that something had been done and could not be spoken aloud. The families of the 19 were never called, never told to gather, never given bodies to bury. Their grief had been made permanent, bound to silence in the same way their sons had been bound in chains. Still, the legacy endured, not in stone or plaque, but in the way Hollow Creek became a warning. Scholars who traced prison history found patterns they could not fully explain. Why were certain rules written with such precision about sound, light, or confinement? Why were punishments forbidden not only for cruelty but for psychological distortion? Why did inspection laws suddenly include measures about chapels, rituals, and unsanctioned gatherings? The answers pointed back to a place never named, but always present. Hollow Creek lived on in the fine print of law, in the fear that silence could be used as a weapon sharper than any blade. For the town, the legacy was heavier still. Generations grew up under the shadow of the marsh, told never to wander near, never to speak too freely about what had stood there. The legend became folklore, but it carried too much detail to be dismissed as a story. 19 voices counting, the sound of chanting in fog, the feeling of eyes watching from where the walls once stood. These tales were passed not for entertainment but for warning. Children were told that evil does not come roaring, that it does not always carry chains or fire. Sometimes it comes with a gentle smile, with a steady voice, with a hand that folds neatly in prayer. Elias Grieves had long been buried by then, his death certificate clean, his name respected in official histories. He was remembered in town ledgers as a pious man, a charitable man, a figure of stability. But for those who lived close to the marsh, his name was not spoken without unease. They knew his legacy was not kindness, but erasure. He had shown how cruelty could thrive in silence, how rituals could be hidden behind order, how entire lives could be dissolved not with violence alone, but with the quiet rewriting of records. His lesson was not only in the deaths of the 19, but in how easily the world had accepted their absence. And so Hollow Creek's legacy endures not in crumbling stone, but in the reminder it leaves behind. That institutions can mask ritualistic cruelty beneath the language of justice. That evil does not need chaos to thrive when it has silence. The jail collapsed. The marsh reclaimed its stones, but the truth of what was done there remained, pressing like damp in forgotten walls, seeping into laws written after, into fears carried forward. It is the kind of legacy that cannot be erased, because it proves something people would rather not believe, that under the right hands even mercy can be turned into ritual, and even faith can become a weapon. Elias Grieves never faced punishment for the 19 who vanished. He died quietly in his own bed, a Bible resting on his chest, his lips curved in the same calm smile he carried through the halls of Hollow Creek. To the town he left behind, he was remembered as a man of faith, a figure of order, someone who had kept the jail running in years of chaos. No grave bore curses, no record carried accusations. His reputation was sealed in gentleness, while the truth of his cruelty remained buried in silence. It was as if the world chose not to see, as if the 19 lives were a debt written off in neat handwriting, erased not by justice but by design. Yet his methods outlived him, not in the form of mirrored coffins or echo chambers, but in the philosophy they revealed. He had shown how entire lives could be destroyed without fire or spectacle, how men could be erased not by chaos but by order, by rituals hidden beneath the appearance of law. His lesson was not only in the pain he inflicted, but in the way it disappeared from record, in how suffering was consumed by silence until only rumor remained. This is how systems carry evil forward, not through loud cruelty, but through quiet obedience, through faces trusted, through hands folded neatly as lives are crossed out. The 19 men of Hollow Creek became more than prisoners lost in fog. They became a symbol of how history hides its ghosts. Their screams were never written down, their bodies never buried under names, their absence explained away with one word: escape. But silence does not erase truth. It presses into stone, into soil, into the marrow of places that refuse to forget. The marsh still breathes their memory. The ruins still hum with echoes, and those who listen closely swear they hear voices counting, voices waiting. The story of Hollow Creek is not only about what was done in darkness, but about how easily the world accepted it. People chose trust over doubt, calm smiles over uneasy questions, order over justice. That is why the jail was allowed to stand as long as it did, why its secrets were buried so carefully, why the 19 were left without graves. Evil thrives not because it is unseen, but because it is ignored when hidden behind kindness. And so the story closes not with answers, but with a question. Could such silence return? Could faces trusted today hide the same rituals, the same erasures, the same careful destruction of lives? Hollow Creek warns us that the answer is never comfortable, for history is not free of such ghosts. It is full of them, pressed into records rewritten, pressed into walls that once breathed, pressed into silence that waits. What do you think? Could this happen again?